Hello and welcome to number 12 in the series of Chinese Australian History podcasts. And today we're introducing just a comparative. I'm comparing Australian anti-Chinese immigration laws with the American anti-immigration laws. That's to say, Exclusion America, the exclusion laws of the United States, and the White Australia policy in particular. I did this actually quite a number of years ago in 2003 in an article entitled Anglo-Saxonizing Machines, Exclusion America, White Australia. It's been published, and you can look that up on the web, or you can see it on my website, Chinese Australian History, in 88 Objects, if you want to read the article itself. Although I've done a lot more research since then, the article is still a good general summary, and how AI friends do a good job of summarising it and discussing these comparisons and bringing these details out. It's interesting to do this comparison because it just brings out various aspects of the history, and particularly how these things were approached very differently within the legal systems, and resulted in quite a different aspect. The main aspect being that Australia's anti-Chinese immigration laws actually resulted in a much steeper decline in numbers, was much more effective, much more rigorous. The American system, although it was called exclusion, was never very that exclusive, and only resulted in comparison to the Australian case in modest drops in numbers. This is partly due to the inclusion of Hawaii within the United States, which resulted in various other changes, but which I don't go into too much in the article, but it's certainly an interesting aspect, and perhaps we can discuss that at another time. But anyway, I'll let our bot friends discuss things first, and then I'll see you again after they have finished. Thank you.
Welcome to the deep dive. So today we're getting into a really fascinating comparison, looking at the history of Chinese immigration restrictions, specifically comparing the United States and Australia based on the research you've brought to the table. And the goal isn't just, the simple idea that both countries excluded Chinese people. We want to unpack the nuances, the surprising differences in how these policies actually played out.
Absolutely. And there's a core question that really jumps out from the start, isn't there? Why did Australia see such a dramatically steeper fall in its Chinese population compared to the U.S. during this whole exclusion period? The sources suggest it's about more than just the laws on paper.
Exactly. And our main guide for this is Michael Williams's work, Anglo-Saxonizing Machines.
Yeah.
It gives us that comparative look at the policies in the U.S. and the Australian colonies, and then later the Commonwealth.
Right. And it's crucial to understand the shared driver behind a lot of this. Both places, the U.S. and what became Australia, were really aiming to build these predominantly Anglo-Saxon societies. That idea was powerful,
Yeah.
Even places like Hawaii were described as these Anglo-Saxonizing machines, viewing Chinese people as, resistant to fitting in.
And that desire directly led to laws restricting Chinese entry pretty early on in both regions. In Australia, we see the first moves in places like Victoria and New South Wales.
That's right. If we look at Australia first, Victoria brought in restrictions back in 1855. New South Wales followed in 1861. But it's interesting, these initial laws, they weren't about complete exclusion initially.
Okay, so let's unpack those early Australian rules. What did they actually involve?
Mostly they used financial hurdles and ship capacity limits. So you had poll taxes, a fee to enter, and tonnage restrictions, limiting the number of Chinese passengers per ship based on its size. And these rules tightened over time. Like the passengers to per ratio got much stricter, going from 1 per 10 tons down to 1 per 300 tons eventually. The poll tax was often 10 pounds.
Right, so not an outright no entry, but definitely making it harder and more expensive.
Precisely. And an important detail, these laws often allowed existing residents, Chinese residents, to leave and come back within a set time without paying the tax again. But alongside that, there was another really key piece of legislation, denying naturalization. New South Wales did this in 1881. It meant Chinese people living there couldn't become citizens.
That's a fundamental difference right there compared to the U.S. situation, at least initially, denying that pathway to belonging. Okay, so while Australia's putting up these financial and logistical walls, what's the U.S. doing in this early phase?
Well, the first big federal move in the U.S. was the Page Law in 1875. That was the first major federal law targeting Chinese immigration, though its stated aim was preventing entry of prostitutes and sort of undesirable individuals.
So more targeted on paper, perhaps, than Australia's broader approach at that point.
Yes, at least in theory. But the real difference, the divergence in impact, becomes crystal clear when you look at the population numbers. Between the early 1880s, when both places had serious restrictions and peak Chinese populations, and later on, Australia's Chinese population just plummeted, it fell to only 25% of its maximum.
Wow, a 75% drop. That's huge. And the U.S.?
The U.S. Chinese population also dropped, but nowhere near as much, down to about 60% of its peak.
60%, okay.
And what's also really striking is the recovery timeline. The U.S. Chinese population starts to pick up again in the late 1920s.
But Australia's doesn't really rebound until the 1940s. That's a massive gap in demographic recovery. So what changed in Australia around the turn of the century to cause that much sharper decline and delay?
The big turning point was federation in 1901 and the immediate passage of the Immigration Restriction Act. This was, one of the very first laws from the new Commonwealth Parliament, and it was the bedrock of the White Australia policy.
Right, the formal legal expression of that exclusionary goal, but the sources say it didn't actually name Chinese or any race. So how did it work to exclude them?
The key mechanism was the dictation test.
Ah, yes. Infamous.
Absolutely. It required potential immigrants to write down a passage dictated to them in any European language chosen by the official. The official instructions were pretty blunt. It was meant to be an absolute bar or a way to kick people out even after they'd landed. It was basically designed to be failed, Imagine being asked to write in, say, Dutch, if you'd never heard it before.
Yeah, incredibly effective without being explicitly racial on the surface. It sounds much more like a guaranteed exclusion tool than perhaps the U.S. approach, matching that statistic you mentioned earlier.
It really was.
So what about the Chinese people already in Australia before 1901? What happened to them under this act?
They were granted what was called domicile status. This basically gave them the right to leave Australia and return. But it offered very little else in terms of rights or integration. And even to travel, they needed a special document, a certificate exempting from dictation test, or CEDT. You couldn't even buy a ship ticket back to Australia without one. And the shipping companies faced huge fines, £100 per person, if they carried someone without the right papers.
So even just leaving and returning was a bureaucratic nightmare. What if you lost that CET? That must have happened.
Oh, absolutely. And re-entry became a massive headache. You'd need a special letter from the collector of customs, but only if you could be satisfactorily identified. The source mentions a case, Tong, whose CEDT was stolen. He had to get help from a Sydney store to negotiate with customs just to get back in.
Wow. It really shows the everyday hurdles they faced. Okay, so the dictation test was the main barrier. Were there any exceptions, any legal ways in after 1901?
There were a few, very limited ones. Merchants and their families could sometimes get in, but it depended on their business ties in Australia, not on certificates from China. Students could too, but it was a narrow definition, usually younger kids going to specific English schools. And then there were these substitute and assistant provisions. An established merchant or market gardener could temporarily bring someone over to help out or take their place for a while.
And did these exceptions amount to many people?
Not really. Very small numbers. Between 1902 and 1946, something like 6,400 people came in on these temporary certificates, and only about a third of them actually managed to stay permanently. It just highlights how effective the overall White Australia policy was at keeping numbers down.
Okay, so the dictation test handles future immigration. But what about kids born in Australia to Chinese parents after 1901? Were they automatically citizens?
That's where it gets really murky. Their citizenship status was actually quite ambiguous. An Australian birth certificate could help with re-entry, but it wasn't a guarantee, especially if they'd been away for a long time. And kids born overseas to Chinese parents living legally in Australia, they had no automatic right of entry at all. Getting in often came down to subjective things: perceived class, English ability. The decision seemed pretty inconsistent, almost ad hoc.
It sounds like a much tighter, more consistently restrictive system in Australia overall compared to what was developing in the U.S. after their 1882 Exclusion Act.
Definitely. I mean, the U.S. laws were called Chinese Exclusion Acts, but they never actually excluded all Chinese people. The only group theoretically barred completely was laborers.
And who was exempt from that category in the U.S.? Who could still get in?
Well, the main exempt groups were merchants, students, teachers, plus their wives and minor children. And they could enter without a time limit. And crucially, people born in the U.S. or the children of U.S. citizens had a right of entry because of their citizenship. This was specifically established for Chinese individuals by a court decision in 1896 and mostly lasted until 1940.
That birthright citizenship aspect is a huge difference, isn't it? You have to wonder about the debates back then, why the two countries landed so differently on that specific point.
Yeah, the sources suggest the U.S. system's greater emphasis on sort of individual rights and legal challenges played a part. Australia seemed more focused on that collective vision of a white society.
Okay, and what about Chinese laborers who had already lived in the U.S. before the restrictions? Could they leave and come back?
Yes, prior residents classified as laborers did have a right to return, though the rules got tighter over time. Eventually, they needed proof of $1,000 in assets or debts and had to stick to a strict 12-month return certificate. Merchants could also leave and return as long as they could prove they were still part of a legitimate business.
And the U.S. definition of merchant was quite different from Australia's, wasn't it? Much broader.
Yes, significantly broader. At least initially, Australia's definition was always narrower, focused on import-export, later tied to financial turnover. In the U.S., merchant initially meant pretty much any partner in a business. It did get narrowed down later by courts and new laws excluding laundries, restaurants, eventually focusing on foreign trade by 1932.
Right.
But even with those changes, it generally stayed wider than the Australian definition.
Right.
And that broader definition also meant merchants' wives and minor kids could enter the U.S. And those kids could potentially become merchants themselves later on.
It really feels like the U.S. system, even with the exclusion label, just had more cracks, more potential pathways, both for initial entry and for families, compared to Australia's more sealed-off approach.
That's a really good way to put it. And the administration of the systems was totally different too. In the U.S., the main job at the port of entry was figuring out someone's status. Are they really a merchant? A wife? A U.S.-born citizen? This meant, long interviews, detailed background checks, and very often, court appeals against the initial decision.
The source mentions certificates issued back in China for people claiming merchant or student status heading to the U.S. Did those carry much weight?
Often, not as much as you'd think. Those certificates from officials in Canton or Hong Kong, even visaed by U.S. consuls, were sometimes, obtainable for a price. The real decision was always made by the U.S. immigration officials on arrival. There's an example of a document from 1917 for someone named Yi Sam explicitly stating his admissibility would be determined after he got to the U.S.
So less focus on pre-cleared documents compared to Australia's CEDT system.
Exactly. Australia put the onus on identification before travel, using the CEDT in finding shipping companies. The U.S. focused on that intensive assessment at the border.
Which must have created a lot of anxiety and delay for people arriving in the U.S.
Definitely. And the U.S. system was constantly changing, too. The exclusion laws were reenacted, amended, interpreted differently by courts. You had things like the Scott Act in 1888 suddenly canceling return certificates for thousands who were already overseas. The Geary Act brought in mandatory registration. Definitions of laborer, student, merchant kept shifting. It was complex.
Yeah, that 1924 situation you mentioned sounds bizarre. Citizens' wives barred while non-citizens' wives could enter?
Right. It shows the kind of contradictions that could arise. It was eventually fixed by the courts for earlier marriages, but it highlights the messy, evolving nature of U.S. law compared to Australia's more consistent, if harsh, approach.
This constant legal churn in the U.S. must have made it incredibly difficult for Chinese immigrants to know where they stood.
It really did. And that focus on proving status on arrival, relying on affidavits, witness testimony, especially for birthright citizenship claims, it naturally led to more court involvement. People challenged decisions. Australia's system, with the dictation test and broad bureaucratic power, was much harder to challenge legally.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly. How did a huge global event like World War II affect these policies in both countries?
That's a key moment. The Japanese invasion of China definitely generated a lot more public sympathy for Chinese refugees in both the U.S. and Australia.
Right.
In the U.S., this sympathy was a big factor leading to the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Acts in 1943. They were replaced by a tiny annual quota, only 105 people. But crucially, Chinese immigrants were finally allowed to become U.S. citizens, and non-citizen spouses of U.S. citizens could now enter. Plus, the War Brides Acts brought over thousands of Chinese women.
So quite a significant shift.
Yes. Despite some complexities still around citizenship for those born outside the U.S., these changes really boosted the Chinese American population, helped balance the genders, and allowed families to form and grow.
A real turning point for that community. What about Australia? Did the wartime sympathy lead to similar changes there?
Australia felt the sympathy too, but the policy response was very different. They largely stuck with the White Australia policy. The Immigration Restriction Act stayed mostly intact until 1958. There was a bit of an increase in people coming in under those assistant and substitute loopholes, especially for Chinese restaurants, which started becoming more popular in the 50s. But the numbers were small. Australia didn't see that kind of major demographic transformation in its Chinese community like the U.S. did post-war, not until much later, really the 1960s.
So even shared global events were filtered through these deeply ingrained different national policy frameworks. It really highlights how the foundations were laid differently.
Absolutely. And if you look at where the anti-Chinese sentiment first really took hold, in Australia, it was Victoria, New South Wales, the Gold Rush colonies. In the U.S., it was California. These were all places settled relatively recently by, white settlers after displacing indigenous people. The gold rushes brought in all sorts of newcomers, including many Chinese, and that sparked hostility from those who felt they had more right to be there or feared the economic competition.
And while the initial hostility hit various outsider groups, the anti-Chinese feelings seemed to stick around much longer.
Partly because Chinese immigrants often stayed on in the gold fields or other jobs after other groups moved on. Now, comparing the governments back then, the Australian colonies were generally older, more established administrations, often starting as penal colonies with pretty strong British oversight. California, on the other hand, was newer as a U.S. state, having come from Mexico, and went through a much more lawless vigilante period during the gold rush.
And that difference in government control probably explains why California saw much more actual violence against Chinese communities, expulsions, massacres that didn't really happen on the same scale in Australia.
Exactly. Australia had discriminatory rules like the Goldfield Acts, regulating Chinese camps, but the level of mob violence seems to have been significantly worse in California. Also, the Australian colonies had more direct control over their own immigration policies, even if London sometimes pushed back. They could pass laws, repeal them, bring them back. By 1888, most colonies had anti-Chinese laws, and the Commonwealth passing the dictation test in 1901 shows that continued control.
Whereas California, being part of the U.S. Federation, kept seeing its state laws challenged in federal courts. Federal restrictions only came later when California gained more political clout.
Right, and that lack of consistent state control in California might have actually fueled the creation of other kinds of discriminatory laws targeting Chinese residents, things about where they could live, what jobs they could do, which didn't have such an early parallel in Australia.
The politics of trade and labor also seem critical here.
Hugely. Both London and Washington were initially hesitant about harsh restrictions because of trade interest with China. But trade was a bigger factor holding back U.S. restrictions than Australian ones, partly because Australia's trade with China had declined more by then.
And the working class political power difference.
That seems key. In Australia, the labor movement was stronger, more unified politically, especially with the Labor Party emerging. This made Chinese restriction a higher priority, with less willingness to compromise, more cross-party consensus. In California, the anti-Chinese movement included workers, sure, but also many small business owners, self-employed people. The coalition was maybe a bit broader, but potentially less unified on specific labor goals.
Okay, let's drill down into the legal frameworks again. Citizenship and the courts, clearly huge differences.
Massive. As we said, U.S.-born Chinese were citizens, could pass it on to kids born overseas, confirmed by the Supreme Court. In Australia, citizenship for the Australian-born was fuzzy. And even if they were citizens, their overseas-born kids had no automatic right to enter. Re-entry could be denied after long absences. Entry often depended on subjective things like class, English skills, perceived caste.
And the courts played a much bigger role in the U.S. narrative.
Definitely. The Chinese community in the U.S. used the courts constantly, challenging laws like the Page Act with habeas corpus, often winning or at least forcing changes. In Australia, major court challenges were less common. Partly because the laws gave bureaucrats so much discretion, they were written to avoid court challenges. You couldn't really appeal the dictation test if the official administered it correctly. It was designed to be unchallengeable.
Geography mattered too, didn't it? Borders.
Oh yeah. The U.S. land borders with Canada and Mexico made smuggling a huge issue. People tried to cross illegally. Australia, being an island, meant smuggling was mostly by ship, which was perhaps easier to control through port checks and shipping company liability. And this difference connects to that phenomenon mostly unique to the U.S. paper sons.
Right, that system of fraudulent entry. Explain that again briefly.
Basically, a U.S. citizen of Chinese descent, maybe returning from a trip to China, would falsely claim he'd had a son born there. This created a legal identity, an entry slot, which could then be sold to someone in China who wanted to immigrate but couldn't legally. It became a massive channel for entry into the U.S. Estimates suggest maybe 30–40% of entries in some periods. Tens of thousands of people came in this way.
And nothing really comparable happened in Australia.
Not on that scale. The Australian system, with the CEDT for return travel and the focus on shipping companies preventing undocumented arrivals, just didn't create the same opportunity for that specific kind of fraud.
So paradoxically, the U.S. system, aiming for exclusion, ended up with more loopholes, both legal and illegal, because of how it was structured. And this even shows up in the paperwork.
It does. The source notes Australian immigration files are often most complex right around 1901 when they were setting up the system. Then they get simpler. U.S. files tend to get more complex over time, more documents, longer interviews, more investigations trying to catch fraud, reflecting that ongoing struggle at the border.
Okay, stepping back from the laws themselves, what about the impact on people's lives? Beyond just being excluded or let in?
Well, the source pushes back against seeing immigrants as just wanting to settle permanently. Many had other goals: earn money for family back home, escape chaos, maybe return later. Their plans changed. One big impact we touched on was the scarcity of women. It predated the main laws, but was definitely made worse by them, especially in Australia.
Right, though you noted U.S. laws didn't specifically target women, except the Page Law.
Exactly. And cultural factors like preference for sons migrating also played a role. Interestingly, despite tightening U.S. restrictions, the percentage of women entering the U.S. actually rose between 1900 and 1930. So other things were happening too: conditions in China, personal choices.
But Australia remained far more skewed towards men because of the difficulty for non-merchants to bring families.
Very much so. Even merchants' wives faced restrictions after 1903. Both systems, though, clearly favored merchants' people with money, English skills, education, either overtly or just in practice.
And all these entry systems, legal or illegal, created their own economies within the Chinese communities.
For sure. Getting fake papers, bribing officials, paying smugglers at all cost money.
Yeah.
People took out loans, had to work for years to pay them off, which often meant staying longer than they first planned. The source even points out that U.S. citizens reported having way more sons than daughters born overseas compared to non-citizens, maybe reflecting the value of creating those male paper son slots.
Fascinating. What about connections back home? Did patterns of visits differ?
Seems like it. Sydney-based Chinese seem to go back more regularly every few years, maintaining ties, maybe planning to retire in China. California records suggest less frequent returns. Maybe because re-entry felt more uncertain in the U.S., or maybe it reflects class differences too. Hard to say for sure.
And it's even possible the very strict Australian 1901 Act pushed some families who had Australian connections to try their luck with the U.S. instead.
That's a really interesting point the source raises, that families might have strategically shifted their migration focus towards the U.S., seeing more, albeit risky, pathways there, even during the exclusion era.
Okay, so pulling this all together, the key differences are pretty stark, aren't they? Australia had laws that were arguably more effective, more consistently applied, driven by strong labor politics and less worry about trade, and that led directly to that dramatic population drop.
Exactly. Whereas the U.S. had this incredibly complex, often contradictory system. Lots of exemptions driven by trade or treaties. A huge role for citizenship law and the courts. And things like paper sons creating these alternative routes. So paradoxically, you get this perception of intense U.S. exclusion, but the actual population decline was less severe than Australia's.
Yeah, those specific details, the dictation tests, the paper sons, the different travel patterns, they really bring home the human side, the complexities beyond just the laws. And the sheer resourcefulness of Chinese communities navigating these systems is just incredible.
It really is. And it leaves you, the listener, with something to think about. Given these very different historical paths, what might the long-term legacies be for the Chinese communities in each country for broader race relations? The source really makes us question what exclusion even means when you look closely, and reminds us that the people trying to navigate these systems had complex lives and motivations.
Absolutely. This deep dive has really only scratched the surface of this incredibly rich history. We definitely encourage you to explore the sources further and keep digging into the lasting impacts of these policies. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that discussion of the comparison of the anti-Chinese immigration laws of both Australia and also the pre-Australian colonies, and of the United States, or particularly California. And again, although we haven't gone into great detail, then it's interesting to see how California and the colonies of Australia were both beholden to a capital far from their own shores. So California had to listen to what the federal government in Washington was saying, whereas the colonies had to listen to London. In many ways, and this influenced many aspects of this history. I go into that in a little bit more detail in my book, Returning Home to Glory, if you're interested in it, but I'll probably introduce a podcast where I'll talk a bit more about these aspects at a future date. This article, as I mentioned, Anglo-Saxonizing Machine, has been published already in 2003, so it's not strictly speaking a child study press publication, but I probably will include it in a future publication of collected articles similar to that where you can read them all in one hit, but I'll mention that again at a future date. So as usual, if you wish to look at any of the publications of Child Study Press, go to Child Study Press at gmail.com. Write to me if you want any more information about these publications or any other of the publications, or any questions about Chinese Australian history. And we'll see you next time. Thank you very much for listening.